Hello, I'm Dr. Jonathan Ross, professor at Western Kentucky University here in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Welcome to our podcast where I interview and interact with my father, pastor and Bible teacher, Chino Ross, on a variety of topics that relate to Christian doctrine and practice. So, Dad, we're back. The last few weeks we've been discussing cessationism, or the anti-charismatics, and their various arguments and trying to deal with them sequentially. I guess before we get started with what we're going to do in this video, let me go ahead and read our verses. I almost forgot. So let's pull those up. We're going to try to read these every time we do our podcast.
Yeah, they're good verses in Philippians 1.
Yes, just to hammer home the point that of what these verses are saying, that all these things that the whole point of the podcast and everything that we're talking about, it all needs to be done in love and sincerely and all those things. So it says, Paul speaking to the Philippians, "And this I pray, that your love may abound yet more and more in knowledge and in all judgment, that ye may approve things that are excellent, that ye may be sincere and without offense until the day of Christ." So, in this video, we are going to deal with one particular point that the cessationists like to think they make. I'm going to say that, or a point that they make, or a statement that they make, and that's what we're going to do in this video. So the statement is this: the New Testament period, or the first Christian century, witnessed a decline in the operation of the miraculous gifts. What would you say to that statement?
So the first Christian century, that whole New Testament era, saw a decline in the miraculous gifts. Well, it's a statement like that in some form or fashion has often been made by the cessationist. So I take that to mean that if we look at the New Testament period from early on in it, let's say the ministry of Jesus, that the miracles, if they're saying that there is a decline in the operation of miracles or miraculous gifts, that they started up somewhere and they declined, whether they went like this or like this. They started at a high point, they began to decline, and by the time we get to the end of the first century, according to them, we would have fewer miraculous gifts in operation. I think that's what that statement is saying. So my response would be, there's only two possible ways that you can make that statement with any certainty. Number one, you would had to have been alive then. And you would had to have been alive and been able to attest to miracles that you saw. You would have had to live long enough so that you saw them begin to decline. You would have to continue to live even a little longer so that you saw that by the end of your life, or by the end of the first century, that they had declined rather dramatically from when you first began to attest to them until the end of that century, the end of your life. Well, the only way for that to have happened is you would have to be 2,000 years old.
I mean, it's an empirical observation. It's an observation about numbers, and the only way that you know for sure is if you were there. That's right.
Is if you were there. But you know what? Even that wouldn't work, because you are a person located in space and time. You may move around, but you're only in one place at one time.
That's true. You wouldn't even know if you were there, if they had declined or not.
You would never know. They could have been going on everywhere except where you are.
That's right.
So I'm trying to think of how can you make that claim that there was a decline in the miraculous gifts. The only other way you could make that claim, since we know that is not a valid way to have done it, is there has to be some reliable primary source evidence. And historians know what primary source means. Primary means eyewitnesses. This
Right.
isn't someone who heard. Primary means there has to be primary source evidence. It has to be an eyewitness account. It has to be something that, because it's eyewitness, we feel that it's reliable and trustworthy.
That's right.
So we do have those documents. They're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Peter, Paul, James, and Jude. And if you believe Hebrews was anonymously written, then the book of Hebrews. So yeah, we do have primary source documents, the New Testament record. And so what I think they really mean is not that the first century witnessed a decline, because that's just a statement that's neither here nor there. What they really mean is that the New Testament, as it goes forward chronologically, mentions the miraculous gifts less often. So now this is something that we can document. We can either prove or disprove. You would need to know, have some opinion, come to some consensus with regard to the dates of the New Testament books, or more importantly,
Right.
you would have to understand the periods which they cover. So I think we would probably all agree that regardless of dates of the books, for instance, the little epistle of James is probably the earliest book, probably written in 45 AD. But he's writing to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. As far as the time periods, the Gospels would be the first book we would have to look at, because they cover the earliest time period that's under discussion. Then we would go to the book of Acts, because that covers the next time period under discussion. This would be the chronological order of the New Testament.
Right after Christ ascended. That's right. That's the next chronological time period.
And then we would have to go through the epistles, Paul's epistles, Peter's epistles. We've already mentioned James, and then the Johannine literature, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. And so now we're on to something. Now we've got someone actually thinking. I think the non-charismatics have made these blanket statements. Oh, there's a decline in miracles. And someone has said, well, you can't prove that.
You can't prove
So
that.
they go, oh yeah, that's right. I didn't live then, so I can't prove that. So I need to refine my statement. And I appreciate the fact they refined it, because you have to, or you don't have any ground to stand on. So they have refined it to say, well, the New Testament documents, which are our reliable eyewitness primary source accounts, they do give us a history of, let's just say, the early church, but from the beginning of the ministry of Jesus until the book of Revelation around AD 95. So about a 60-year period. We do have chronology there. We can go and look in those books. We can look in the Gospels and see how many miracles do we have. And I don't have any of these statistics, but let's just pick random numbers. Let's say there's 40 miracles in the Gospels. Then let's say we go to Acts and we see, these are just totally arbitrary. We see 20 miracles. And then we go to, 2nd Peter and 2nd Timothy. These are things written in the end of the 7th decade of the 1st century. And we see 10 miracles. Let's just say we saw 40, we saw 20, we saw 10.
For the sake of the example, yes, let's assume some things and let's just see where we're going. Yeah.
Then what do we have? We actually can compile some statistics, some valid, that we could all agree upon,
right?
Some statistics of the record. We're not talking about the occurrence. We don't know what occurred except by what is recorded.
That's right.
So we have some statistics of the recording of miraculous gifts. We've got them from the Gospels to the early church period to the end of the first Christian century.
If that was the case, then we would have that. But there's a huge elephant in the room, and we'll get to this maybe in a whole another video by itself. We're not willing to secede anything that's not true. We're fighting against their refinement of statement that the New Testament mentions the miraculous less and less as time goes by chronologically. We're going to fight against that even. But even if we granted that that was true, even if we try to fight against that and we find out, no, that actually is right, there's this huge elephant in the room, and it's the whole argument of silence from silence. And hopefully our viewers understand that, and we're going to get to that in another video. But even if we find that that's right, the New Testament does mention the miraculous less and less. That in and of itself does not mean that the gifts happen less and less. Just because it's mentioned less and less logically doesn't imply that they happen less and less. That's an argument from silence. It's an illogical argument. But that's a little bit of an aside, and I guess a Hansel and Gretel breadcrumb, as you like to say, for future video. So I found a video online here. It's an interview between Justin Peters is interviewing Dr. Tom Pennington. Both of these folks have relatively big followings, and they've been very publicly vocal in their opposition to the Holy Spirit gifts, miraculous gifts, still being in operation today. They've openly opposed that. And I found a clip in the video where they are making that refined statement, and so that our viewers can hear it straight from them of what their refined statement is. So let's watch this clip. It's about 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Okay.
All right. And another one of the pushbacks, Tom, is the argument that the sign gifts faded as we go through the New Testament chronologically, which, of course, the books in our Bibles are not necessarily ordered chronologically, but as you go through them chronologically, as according to the events that they record, then you say that those miracles faded away fairly quickly, like the healings on the island of Malta about the year AD 58. And after that, there's no more mention of miraculous gifts. There's no more mention of true miracles like at raising the dead or healing the sick. And you point out that the Apostle Paul wrote 9 other epistles, not to mention the epistles of the Apostles Peter and John. In none of those letters, epistles, is there any mention of how to walk in these sign gifts, perform these sign gifts? And yet these were written as instructions for the churches. And he would say that you can't make an argument from silence.
The elephant in the room is entered.
Well, then I will address it now or here in a moment. Yeah, Justin Peters is a well-known figure on YouTube. He's not only a non-charismatic, he's definitely in the John MacArthur camp. He is anti-charismatic. And this argument holds no water at all. I'm just trying to remember everything he said in that clip. There are so many inaccuracies in that clip. And I would appreciate people being 2 things, more biblical and more logical.
Yep.
Let me start with the biblical of what I just heard. Nowhere does the New Testament call these sign gifts.
No.
Nowhere is that used. Give me chapter and verse for that. And I know why they have done it. The gifts are the gifts of the Holy Spirit in 1 Corinthians 12. They are never called, these 2 words are never linked, sign gifts. The reason that the non-charismatic cessationist people have linked that is they're wanting the gifts to be a sign of the authority and ministry of the apostles. And if they can eliminate the apostles and say when the last apostle died, that's the end of the apostles, then the need to demonstrate the authority of their message via signs, that also ceased. And since the gifts are sign gifts, then the gifts ceased. I know exactly why they did that. That's very crafty. I will give them that. But I would warn their audience and people listening, that's not a biblical phrase. That's not biblical terminology.
Let me interpose for just a second, and then you can get to the logical part, the second part that you would appreciate people being logical. Quick interpose here. maybe it is a biblical phrase, but the way in which it's a biblical phrase is not the way that they want it to be a biblical phrase. Mark 16, Jesus said, "These signs shall follow those that believe on me." And one of those signs was they will speak with new tongues. So, all right, it's a sign gift and it follows those who believe. So if you don't do it, you're not a believer. Anyway, quick little, of course, they would say, well, that part of the Bible wasn't really in the original manuscripts. It was part of verses 9 through the end of the chapter of Mark 16, and it wasn't in a lot of the manuscripts, whatever. But you can find the same concepts in those verses elsewhere in the Bible, which was in the manuscripts. And so whether it was or was not, the concept still is there. It's still true. Anyway.
Yes, I agree. And you have to anticipate what the objections of your adversary will be. And I rarely use Mark 16 because I know that's exactly where they'll go. And once they go there, that passage is dead in the water, so to speak, and becomes a moot point. I heard another statement Justin made. He was talking about the number of miracles in Acts. And then he talked about Paul wrote 9 other epistles. But many of those epistles were written during the time period covered in the book of Acts, Romans and Corinthians and Thessalonians. So that also, I don't even know that he realized he did that, but he was trying to go chronologically, talking about the events in Acts and then go to Paul's epistles. Well, that doesn't work if many of those epistles, not all of them, but most of Paul's epistles were written during this period covered in the book of Acts.
That's right.
You would have to go to your pastoral epistles, Timothy and Titus, before you're getting past much of this time period covered in the book of Acts. So, you know, I can hear several things in his statement, and I feel sorry for the audience. If the audience is not biblically trained and biblically knowledgeable, then, you know, these things go right by you. And these big name speakers are able just to snow you under with things that are not true.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But back to where we were, and that is the New Testament, they say it mentions miraculous gifts less often. And I said before you read this clip, if we went in the Gospels, went to Acts, went to epistles, we could see some kind of decline in the reference. But that's not all they mean. What they also mean is the New Testament mentions miraculous gifts less often, and therefore there was a decline in their operation.
Right.
So that's where the problem lies. You know, statistics, you are a professor of accounting and mathematics. Statistics are just facts that are bare numbers. That's all they are. We all have the same statistics. Any one of us on this side or that side of the argument can go to any book in the New Testament. We can figure them out in their chronological order. We can go to them. We can compile a list of statistics, and we will all agree it'll be pretty much what I just said. There's a higher reporting of miracles early in the New Testament period. The reporting of them declines by the end of the New Testament period. Those are the facts.
The question is
why.
But
it's the interpretation of the facts that make all the difference in the world. It's the interpretation of the facts where you show your mettle as a thinker and as a Bible teacher. In our political society, a conservative think tank organization can go and collect their facts, and a liberal one can go and collect theirs. They can end up with the same statistics of how many people are on welfare, of what the unemployment is, of what the crime rate is. We can come up with the same facts, but interpreting those facts, like I say, that's where you show your mettle.
In a research, using the jargon from academia, doing causal inference with the empirical data that you have, that's the hard part. You're trying to infer some causal relationship between variables from the data you have. We're trying to figure out what caused or why were the miracles mentioned less often? And they say because they happen less often, and we're saying not necessarily. Anyway.
That's right. And when he said some people say that's an argument from silence, anybody with a brain says that's an argument from silence. That is a classic argument of silence. The definition. You can't get away from that. I don't even know that they know what an argument of silence is. If they do, then they are deliberately lying to people. this is, if they do know what an argument of silence is, then this isn't done unintentionally. This is a deliberate misleading of the people. Here's what an argument of silence is. It's when you take the fact that there is an absence of reference to something, and you say that the absence of reference is absence, period.
It's a
And nobody in their right
pitfall.
mind.
It's an example.
Nobody in their right mind believes that or agrees with that.
It's one of the
If there is an
examples.
absence of reference, you know what that proves? It only proves one thing, that there's an absence,
of reference.
That's the only thing it proves. It does not prove an absence of occurrence. You know, if you were to write a book about me, your father, and it had 4 chapters in it, and you talked about me in the first chapter, and didn't talk about me in the second chapter or the third, and talked about me in the fourth, let's say, doesn't mean that I wasn't there in the second or third. It just means you've got some other purpose in mind.
That's right.
So yes, you know, and I think that in that video, which I've heard that video of Dr. Pennington and Mr. Peters earlier, it seems like that Dr. Pennington toyed around with this. Well, yes, you're right. Some people say it's an argument from silence, but really it's not. Oh, please. You have better training than that. It absolutely is an argument from silence.
I mean, I'll give Justin Peters a pass, not being as educated as Dr. Tom Pennington. Okay. But somebody who has a PhD degree or a THD degree, whatever, which I'm guessing he has, you can't be making logical blunders like that. I mean, these are basic level logic 101. You cannot fall into those types of pitfalls and traps of arguing from silence. I mean, when you learn logic, the professor, they'll list the most common pitfalls logical reasoning wise, and that's one at the very top, and then there's others as well. You can't be making those blunders, and they have huge audiences, and it's just a travesty that folks making these types of blunders have this type of audience. Now, the question though really is, I mean, he's highly educated, so you think he does know exactly what an argument from silence is, and he knows he's making one, but he's just going to do it anyway.
Probably so.
He's going to do it anyway because there's a different motive, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume he knows what an argument. I mean, they were anticipating the objection that some people will say this is an argument of silence. So if you're anticipating the objection, I think that you know that it is an argument from silence, and I think you know that that's going to be the objection. I think you know that the objection is accurate, because anybody with a 5th grade education knows that lack of reference to a matter doesn't mean the matter didn't exist. The only thing you prove from that is that you didn't refer to it. That's all you can prove from that. Let me give you an example over in Luke chapter 4. I can't give you the verses, but it's somewhere in the middle of that chapter with the 2 prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And it does not apply to miracles. My application of this is to use it in the same way we're looking at a decline or an absence of reference. What does that really mean? In Luke 4, Jesus is in his hometown Nazareth. It's his first sermon. Doesn't go over very well. They basically want to kill him and get rid of him. And so he makes a statement that a prophet's not without honor in his own town. In other words, that he's not going to be received in Nazareth. If he's going to be received, it'll be by someone else and in some other place. And then he pulls 2 analogies from the Old Testament, one in 1 Kings with regard to the ministry of Elijah, and one in 2 Kings with Elisha. And the one with Elijah, Jesus says that Elijah helped this Phoenician woman in the city of Sidon, in Zarephath. So she's a Phoenician woman, a widow, and that he helped her. But he makes a statement that there were many widows in Israel. And in the next example, Elisha heals Naaman, the Syrian or the Aramean of leprosy. And Jesus said there were many lepers in Israel.
Right.
My point there is, if we were reading the account in First Kings and we read about Elijah's kind, benevolent favor toward this widow, we might assume she was the only widow there. And
But she
guess what?
wasn't.
She wasn't.
Thankfully, we
Or
have this
we might
reference in Luke.
assume
We know
that there was only one leper, and it was Naaman. But Jesus said, no, in fact, there were many. So my point in using that passage is to caution people, because you read of a healing somewhere later in the New Testament, you might be tempted to assume there must have been only a healing.
Good. This is a good example, a good counter example to kind of show what the danger you can get into by making
Yes.
an argument from silence, like they're doing.
It is an argument from silence. It's basic, as you said, 101 logic. My training, Jonathan, early in my life was in epistemology and logic and philosophy. And I had all of that before I ever had biblical studies. And our hope and wish for our audience is that they will be both biblical and logical. And to be one is to be the other. You can't separate the two.
They're not set, we're not pitting one against the other. I mean, 2 + 2,
one
like you said, is always equal to 4,
other.
whether you're in the church or out of the church.
Yes. So back to our question. Or to our discussion, let me ask you a question. I'll put you on the spot, but you know the answer. So, but let me ask you a question, and I want to show you will, and I want to show the audience how this works in the New Testament, in the Bible, and in life. I want to show the audience how this works. So here's my question. Just answer the question, nothing else. Just answer the question. How many miracles did John the Baptist do?
0.
Okay. I asked the question, how many miracles did John the Baptist do? And you said none. How do we know that he didn't do any miracles?
Because there's a verse that tells us that he didn't do any.
Of course. If there was not that verse, and that verse is John 10:41.
Let's go pull it up.
If there was
I
not
tell
that,
you which verse it was. I don't know my Bible that well. But
if there was not that verse, then you could not say John the Baptist did no miracles.
That's true.
You could only say there are no recorded miracles of John the Baptist.
That's right.
So Dr. Pennington and Mr. Peters, you are in gross logical error.
That's right.
And in order to continue to teach your stuff, whatever it is you want to teach, you need to clean your act up here.
What's the verse again?
I think it's at the end of John 10.
Yep, right here.
I'll look it up real quickly.
Verse 40 of John 10. This is
John
Jesus.
10:41. Many resorted unto him and said, John did no miracle, but all things that John spake of this man came true.
See, I knew that there was that verse, but I just didn't know where it was. That's how I knew that John the Baptist didn't do a miracle.
Well, it's really important to show people this is how you do biblical studies. If the Bible doesn't tell us something didn't exist, you can't say that it didn't. The only thing you can say is it's not recorded.
Right.
So if we never saw a miracle of John and didn't have this verse, I guess Mr. Pennington could say, well, John did no miracles, but there'd be no way to prove that. But now there is a way, and that is in John 10:41. John did no miracles. So I will, this is a very important fact that this is the statistic that miracles, they're not sign gifts. There's no such thing as that in the New Testament, because we know what they're after. Miraculous healings, miraculous events, they are mentioned less often as the New Testament chronologically goes on. So how should we interpret that? Well, here you can think up your own possibilities. I'm asking people to think. They are recorded less often. Why is that so? Well, here's one possible answer. They occurred less often. That's one possible answer.
That is a possible answer logically.
The reason they're mentioned less is because they occurred less. That is a possible answer. I don't think that's the biblical answer, but it's definitely a possible answer if we're just using our statistics based on the numbers.
That's true.
Another possible answer, and people can sit out there and think of their own. If you think deeply, and I always encourage people to think, maybe they were needed less often. Maybe there were fewer sick people.
Everybody had gotten
don't
healed
think
so
that's
much
possible.
with Jesus and the apostles' ministry. Everybody's already healed. They don't need any.
They're already healed. I think that's highly unlikely, but is that possible? Absolutely. That's possible. There's fewer sick people around.
Just empirically, and fewer people that have demons inside of them that need casting out, and fewer needs for miracles.
But let's be clear. I don't think that's the correct inference that we should draw. What's another inference?
Probably
I'll give
not.
you another one that is very biblical. Maybe God was less able to work in people's lives. And what makes God less able to work in people's lives? Matthew chapter 13 and verse 58.
Oh, hold on.
I mean, if this happened in the earthly ministry of Jesus, it could happen at any time, anywhere, with anyone.
He could do no mighty work there except heal a few sick folk because of their unbelief. I believe that's where we're going. Is this correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So Matthew
couldn't do many works because of their unbelief.
What was the verse again? I don't remember the actual verse.
58.
Oh, is it at the very beginning
13.
or at the very end? 30. Yeah, that's why a prophet doesn't have honor in his own country. And he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief.
So why was there a decline in miracles in Jesus' ministry? Why? Well, you say, well, they occurred less frequently. Okay, why? Is it because miracles were passing off the scene? Oh, absolutely not. They occurred less frequently. Yes. Why? It's because of their unbelief. So is that a possible answer? Absolutely.
That's biblically a possible answer. Yes. I
mean,
it's
logically and biblically a possible answer.
The implication from this verse is if they were willing to believe, then definitely miracles would have been done.
Yes, and they would have been, because at other times when he went around people who believed and had faith, then more miracles were done. Again, I want to point out the fact that the cessationists, they're just saying because there's fewer references, that means the miracles were in decline, and it means no such thing.
Right.
I mean, that's a possible answer, but they don't even address anything else that could be possible,
right?
Because they don't want anything. They want that to be the answer, because they don't see miracles in their life. They don't see miracles in their church, and they have to find some justification for that.
And they're not being intellectually honest in all of these.
No, they're not.
In all of their discussion of these things. It's not intellectually honest.
Not at all. So, and here's another possible answer to the question, and it's the one that I would lean toward, because I know the gifts are set in the church. There's so many verses that say that we either have looked at or will look at in other videos. And it's not my intention in this video to try to prove anything like that. But I think the New Testament does say the gifts are in the church. They're going to be in the church as long as the church has sick people and people need to be healed. As long as people need to be delivered, the deliverance will be there. As long as people need to have a word of knowledge, a word of wisdom, prophecy, it's going to be there. We looked at that in our last podcast. The only time, there is going to be a time when all of those gifts cease.
When that which is perfect is come, and that's
that which is perfect is come. And that which is
yet.
perfect, we don't have perfect bodies. We don't have perfect knowledge of the future or of the present or of the past. So we still need the gifts, and we will need those gifts until that which is perfect has come. And those gifts will stay here until that time. So the gifts are always going to be here. They're here now. They were there throughout the first century. So why do we see a decline in their reference? I think it's probably very easy to explain that. Christianity had spread wildly throughout the Mediterranean world, especially the northern Mediterranean world, and there was some to the south down in Egypt and Cyrene, Libya, the parts of northern Africa. We will all agree to that fact that Christianity had spread wildly, I would say, along with the promised gifts of the Holy Spirit. So the churches, so what we did not have in the Gospels and what we did not have in the first chapter of Acts is we have local churches being established everywhere. Now, that does not mean that people don't still need healing and prophecy and tongues, because they have it in Corinthians. And Corinthians is 25 years after Pentecost. First Corinthians is 25 years after Pentecost when Paul's writing to the Corinthians. So we don't see any decline in gifts. We see plenty of gifts happening then.
Yeah.
Your decline is going to be more like this, and then a drop off as far as reference. It's not going to be this gradual thing.
Because I mean,
the
epistles came pretty long after. I mean, Paul spent 14 years. He talks about.
Yes, in Galatians 1. Yes. So they are very footloose and fancy free, Jonathan, in their use of the biblical statistics that we have. So back to my argument, the churches are now founded, and they have been established, and they are everywhere. And so what we see, I mean, it's obvious in the New Testament that the history writing, the Gospels and Acts, that takes a back seat to what the urgent need really is. And that's the doctrinal teaching that the churches need, which is what's provided in the epistles.
Right.
I mean, that should be so clear for anybody to see. It doesn't mean that history isn't still happening. Obviously, history is happening. And it doesn't mean that people don't need healing and all of the gifts of the Holy Spirit. But we have entered a different time period in the early church's history where we actually have churches founded everywhere. And according to Corinthians, they still needed the gifts in that local church. But what the whole body spread out around the Mediterranean world, the church universal, the body of Christ, what it really needs now is doctrinal teaching, which they did not have. And that's why we have Paul's epistles and Peter's and James. Well, James was a lot earlier, and the Apostle John, who's probably writing in the last decade of the first century.
And how ironic, in that much doctrinal teaching, we have whole chapters where Paul is setting forth the doctrines of the gifts.
25 years after Pentecost.
So enough with this
and
nonsense.
Jude is writing way late. Jude is one of the late epistles, and Jude talks about praying in the Spirit, praying in tongues, if you will, Jude verse 20, because according to the New Testament, that's what praying in the Spirit is. So that would be my answer, because it's a valid question. You know, the observation is the reporting of the gifts declines. I admit that. I grant that, because that's what the New Testament record shows.
But why?
So it's a valid question to ask why. The cessationists say, well, the reason why is because they're ceasing. That's an argument from silence.
Right.
Don't ever say that again, because that is an argument from silence. You have to say, I'm going to draw an inference from that. And my inference is, but I can't, you'll have to say, but I can't prove that, because this would be the use of an argument of silence.
You have to be intellectually honest and say they're mentioned less often. There could be multiple reasons why that's the case. One of those reasons is because they happen less often, and I'm going to decide to pick that reason over the other reasons. And this is why,
correct.
And this is why I'm going to do that. And you have to give logical reasons why that reason you think has a higher probability of being the right reason versus all those other reasons. But they don't do that. They just pick that reason. That's it. They don't even acknowledge any of these other points that have been made in this video.
I would appreciate their work and their scholarship better if they would be honest and fully admit and recognize that this is an argument of silence. There are various inferences we can draw from the decline in reference, and the inference I choose to draw is they also declined in occurrence. And if you want to say that, that's an honest statement, and you let the whole cat out of the bag. We would probably also like to know why you chose that among the inferences I gave and others. It would be fair for you to tell us. And of course, what you're going to explain is you just don't believe in the gifts, period. You don't have them in your church.
But we already know that they don't believe.
We already know that.
The question is why, biblically, and then they're in a circle that they can't get out of.
Hey, let's look at one other thing too that I don't know that they've said, but they probably have said, that is really critically important, and that concerns the book of Acts. I think I've heard somewhere, because I've heard a lot of these guys talk ad infinitum about these beliefs that are not biblical, and neither are they logical. but let's stay with biblical, because biblical is easy. It's either in the passage or it isn't. And I have heard them, I know, although I can't quote who has said this, make the claim, and it becomes concerning the book of Acts. I'm getting ahead of myself, but and it comes from a fuzzy feeling after they have read Acts. And I want to describe what that fuzzy feeling is. That fuzzy feeling goes like this. And the argument that follows is, when I read Acts, they say, wow, it just began with a bang.
Right.
And there are miracles happening and supernatural events and the dead being raised and all kinds of things happening. And then as the book of Acts goes on, we don't see miracles very much anymore. That's kind of the microcosm argument that they use for the whole of the New Testament and the New Testament period. But I'm going to tell you right now, that's 100% false. Let's think with our mind. And if you don't know Acts, some of us know Acts. If you don't, that's okay. Read your book of Acts. And if you know Acts, then think with me. So in Acts chapter 3, that's the miracle they think about, that the man at the gate beautiful who was lame from birth was miraculously healed.
Right.
Peter and John, who went there, said, silver and gold have I none, but what we've got, we'll give it to you. In the name of Jesus, rise up and walk.
Right.
And that was a stupendous, miraculous event that did not confirm any New Testament document, but it definitely authenticated the authority that the Apostle Peter and the Apostle John had. Well, guess what? That miracle is the only big one that you find early in Acts. I challenge you to read Acts, and that dominates Acts 3, Acts 4, and Acts 5. That miracle and its repercussions dominate those three chapters, 3,
That's
4,
true.
and 5. Then we get to chapter 6.
Based on that. Yep.
Chapter 6 is the dispute between the Gentiles, the Grecians, and the Hebrews over the women. We have the selection of the 7. Chapter 7 is a highlight of the first Christian martyr, his long speech. We don't have any raising of the dead or miraculous gifts.
Nope. It's
we come to chapter 8.
Then he's stoned.
We come to chapter 8, and we have, let's make sure we underscore this, we have a busboy whose name is Philip. He's not an apostle.
Right.
He's not a prophet.
Right.
According to Acts 6. So again, biblically, we're speaking biblically, he's a busboy. And what does he do in Acts 8 in verses 5 through 7? People gave heed with one accord to the things which Philip spake, hearing and seeing the miracles which he did. Miracles, plural, in a whole town or village, or actually a region. Samaria is a central region between southern Judea and northern Galilee in Israel. Unclean spirits crying with loud voice came out of many that were possessed with them, and many taken with palsies and that were lame. Just like the man in Acts 3, they were lame, were healed. How many people in Acts 3 were healed? One. How many lame people were healed? One. How many lame people were healed later, years after Acts 3?
It says many. It says the word many in my Bible.
It says the word many.
We can go look at the Greek. I'm sure it says many.
Well, I'm just saying we have all of these miracles. Actually, the miracles in Acts are going to increase. Their reference to them, which means their frequency. Well, it does not mean their frequency. The reference to them will increase. So when we get to the end of the book, and as we transpire through the book, and we go through the book, we know that we have a lot of miracles being recorded. In Acts 9, we have the resurrection of the dead. In Acts 13, we have the blinding of Elymas. In Acts 14, signs and wonders are done by the apostles, and Paul himself is raised from the dead. In Acts 16, remember, we went from Acts 3 all the way to Acts 8 before we saw a reference to an abundance of miracles. And the claim
Right.
is miracles are declining. No, 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 no. Reference to miracles is actually going up as we go through the book of Acts, according to Acts, not according to a cessationist, but according to Acts. In Acts 16, Paul has the discerning of spirits, and he's able to cast a demon out of this damsel possessed with the spirit of divination. Look how many miracles we have in Acts 19. Paul is in Ephesus. Paul is on his third missionary journey. First journey was 46 to 48. Second was 49 to 52. Third is 53 to 57. We're in the middle of the fifth decade of the first century. In Acts 19 and verse 12, from Paul's body were brought unto the sick handkerchiefs, plural, and aprons, plural. These are headbands, sweat rags, things that Paul had dried the sweat off his body with as he was doing manual labor. And the diseases, plural, departed from them, plural. And the evil spirits, plural, went out of them,
This is
plural.
stupendous miracles happening at the very end of Acts. How
And it's the
interesting.
nature of the miracles. Paul's not even present.
No, they're
Paul's
stupendous.
not even present.
They're more of a miracle than if he was president. That's my point.
Yes. And there are incredible miracles happening. The sick are being healed. The demon possessed are being delivered. It's all by virtue of proxy. It's all by virtue of something that went from Paul's body to some person, whether near or far, and they're healed of their diseases, and demons go out of them.
Only one such miracle do we know about that happened even with Jesus, when the woman who had an issue of blood touched the hem of his garment, but that garment was on him while he was standing there. In Acts chapter 19, these sorts of miracles are even more stupendous than that in a sense, because these articles aren't on Paul's body when they're being touched by the people. They've been taken from Paul's body and given to the people who are in a different geographic location, and those people are being healed of all their diseases. That's more stupendous in some sense than the lady touching the hem of Jesus's garment.
It's an incredible, miraculous power. And it's similar to Peter in Acts 4 and 5, where just his shadow was able to touch people and they were healed from that shadow. And then if we end with Acts 28, wow. I mean, we're through with what they call the descriptive versus the prescriptive part. We're through with this, with Luke's history, our wonderful first century church historian, the writer Luke. We're at the last chapter of Luke's history in the book of Acts, in Acts 28, and the healing of Publius, his father, rather, on the island of Malta. Acts 28, verses 8 and 9. Came to pass that the father of Publius, who lay sick, Paul entered in, prayed, laid hands on him, and Paul healed him. And then verse 9, when this was done, others also, which had diseases in the island, came and were healed. So my point through this podcast is, in conclusion here, that there's no way for anyone to prove that miracles declined in the first century.
No.
And for you to make that statement, you're completely out of bounds. You know, you have lost your credibility. You've lost your credibility. If you didn't live there and document it, or if you don't have a first source eyewitness account, and you don't,
Primary
that tells
source.
us they declined, you've lost your audience. You've lost your audience. You've lost your credibility. You know, and I hate to say that. That sounds mean-spirited, and I don't mean it. I don't mean it mean-spirited at all.
No, it's just a fact.
But I really want people to see that this is a deception when a person like Mr. MacArthur, I don't believe he has a doctor's degree, maybe not an earned one, maybe an honorary one. And there's no such thing as that. You either earned it or you didn't.
Right.
Mr. MacArthur, Mr. Peters, Dr. Pennington, you've lost your credibility, and you need to be more honest. You need to say that the New Testament doesn't record, does not reference as many, and you cannot draw an inference from that with certainty, an argument from silence, and say, well, we just know from that miracles decline. They actually want to go further. They don't want them to decline, cessation. They want them to cease totally. and that's pure nonsense. Can we turn, Jonathan, to John 20, the Gospel of John, chapter 20 and verse 30?
Excuse me, I had to sneeze there. Oh,
John
yes, I am
20
here already.
and verse 30. I would like to use this to end our podcast today. John, the gospel writer, says, and many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. In other words, you almost could infer that if that's true of John's gospel, could it not be true of the whole New Testament? Enough is written,
Right.
so that we could believe. How many miracles do these unbelieving church members of our day need?
Right.
How many miracles do you need to believe God is a miracle working God? And not that he is. Well, I believe he can. Well, any fool believes he can.
I mean, the
You'd have to
demons
be
believe
dumber
that.
than a boat anchor or a fence post to say, I don't think he can. You haven't said anything by saying, I believe he can.
Right.
There's only a quarter of an inch difference between saying, I believe he can and I believe he can't.
No.
That's almost, or I believe he can, but I know he won't. Those are kissing cousins of each other. So let's be honest.
They feel like
let's be honest and fair. John tells us many other signs, way more than what he's recorded, actually occurred in the first century. There were many more widows in Israel. There were many more people that had leprosy. They just give us one little account. There were probably many more miracles done in the period covered in the book of Acts. We just are given a sampling of that. And there were probably many miracles that occurred throughout the first century because God's people need them. And we are just given a sampling. And why that sampling is not as big at the end as at the first, I said before, I think the needs of the church had shifted, and those miracles did not need to be referenced as much as they were to begin with.
And when we're talking about the whole New Testament, but we showed, if we're talking about Acts, that's not true. They were mentioned
Correct.
just as much, with just as stupendousness, if we want to use that word. I don't think that's a word, but the miracles happening towards the end of Acts are every bit as miraculous as the miracles happening at the beginning of the book. But I think that's a good place to stop. I think we've addressed this question, this initial statement. The New Testament period, or the first Christian century, witnessed a decline in the operation of the miraculous gifts. We've talked about that statement. We've talked about the refinement of that statement that they go to, how it's an argument from silence and things like that. But thank you all for watching this one, and we will see you all in the next one.